You are hungry, not the kind of hungry where you open a fridge and sigh at your options. The kind of hungry where your stomach folds into itself and your hands shake and the last meal you ate was yesterday's bread, hard as a brick, dipped in thin broth made from onions you wouldn't look twice at today. Now imagine that was a good day. For the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, between roughly the years 500 and 1500, food was not a choice. It was not a pleasure. It was the single most consuming question of every single day: where is it coming from, how much is left, and will it make me sick? And the answer to that question defined your entire existence. So what did medieval people actually eat? The truth is far stranger, far more monotonous, and far more fascinating than any Hollywood banquet scene ever suggested. Start with the foundation. The single most important food in medieval Europe was bread, not the soft, sliced, packaged bread you grab from a grocery store shelf. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and made from whatever grain your region could grow. For peasants, this usually meant rye, barley, or a mixed grain bread called maslin, a rough blend of wheat and rye that baked into a heavy, dark loaf. Wealthier households ate manchet, a whiter bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. But even that would taste like a brick to your modern palate. The historian Christopher Dyer, who spent decades studying medieval English standards of living at the University of Leicester, documented in his landmark work, Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages, that bread could account for as much as 80% of a peasant's daily calorie intake. 80%. Your entire body running on loaf after loaf of grain and water. But bread alone could not sustain you. Medieval people knew this instinctively, even without modern nutrition science. And so the second pillar of the medieval diet was pottage, a thick, murky stew that simmered in a pot over the hearth fire, sometimes for days. Pottage was the great equalizer. Everyone from the lowest serf to the middling merchant ate some version of it. The ingredients depended entirely on the season. In spring, you might throw in young cabbage leaves, leeks, wild garlic, and a handful of oats to thicken it. In summer, peas and beans appeared, fava beans especially, which grew well across northern Europe and provided desperately needed protein. In autumn, turnips, parsnips, and whatever root vegetables survived the harvest went into the pot. In winter, if times were hard, your pottage might be nothing more than water, salt, and a few scraps of dried onion. This is the part that shocks most modern viewers. Vegetables were not the colorful, abundant side dishes you see on restaurant plates today. Medieval peasants ate an enormous amount of starchy, fibrous, often flavorless plant matter. Turnips, parsnips, cabbages, onions, these were not gourmet ingredients. These were survival. The Bridget Ann Hennish, a food historian who published Fast and Feast, Food in Medieval Society, described the peasant diet as relentlessly monotonous. The same handful of ingredients, prepared the same way day after day, week after week, with almost no variation except what the seasons dictated. You did not choose what you ate. The weather chose for you. Now here is where class carved the deepest line, because above the peasant diet sat an entirely different world of food, the world of the nobility. And that world was dominated by one thing above all else: meat. Meat was status. Meat was power. Meat was the visible, edible proof that you were not one of the laboring poor. Noble households consumed staggering quantities of it: beef, mutton, pork, venison, rabbit, goose, chicken, swan, peacock. Royal household accounts from the 14th century show that a king's court might go through thousands of pounds of meat in a single month. The servants ate the cheaper cuts. The lord ate the roasted haunches. And the bones, the gristle, the organs, nothing was wasted. Medieval cooking was ruthlessly practical. Every part of the animal had a purpose. But even for nobles, the menu was not endless. Two massive restrictions shaped what everyone, rich and poor alike, could eat and when. The first was the Christian calendar. The medieval church mandated fasting on roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of all days in the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were fast days. The 40 days of Lent were fast days. Advent was a fast day. Ember days, vigils before major feasts, all fast days. And on fast days, you were forbidden from eating meat, eggs, and dairy. That meant for nearly half the year, even the wealthiest lord in Europe sat down to a meal of fish. Salted herring, dried cod, which the Portuguese and Basque fishermen hauled from the North Atlantic in vast quantities. Eels, which were far more prized than you might imagine. Medieval English records are absolutely littered with payments, rents, and debts calculated in eels. Eels were currency. Eels were wealth. Eels were that important. The second restriction was geography and preservation. You could only eat what was available locally, unless you had significant money. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg existed. They were known in medieval Europe, but they traveled thousands of miles from Asia along trade routes controlled by Arab merchants, Venetian traders, and eventually the Portuguese. Spices were astronomically expensive. A single pound of pepper could cost a laborer's entire monthly wage. Saffron was worth more than gold by weight. So when you see a medieval feast depicted in a painting or a film, loaded with spiced meats and colorful dishes, remember, that was the food of the top 1%. The peasant sitting 3 miles away was eating turnip pottage and praying the bread lasted until the next harvest. The discovery of the Americas had not yet happened for most of this period, which means an entire category of foods you take for granted simply did not exist in medieval Europe. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn, no chocolate, no vanilla, no chili peppers, no peanuts, no turkey. Imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes. Imagine Irish food without potatoes. They did not exist yet. European cooking was built on a completely different foundation. Grains, legumes, root vegetables, dairy products, and whatever meat you could afford or hunt. Now let us talk about something you are probably already wondering about. Was medieval food actually good? Could it taste good? The answer is more complicated than you expect. For peasants, flavor came from a small handful of sources: onions, garlic, mustard, herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme that grew wild or in kitchen gardens, and salt, which was expensive but essential. Salt was so critical that entire towns sprang up around salt mines and salt marshes. Salzburg literally means salt city. The word salary comes from the Latin sal, meaning salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it. In medieval Europe, salt preserved meat, flavored pottage, and kept food from rotting. It was a necessity disguised as a luxury. For the wealthy, flavor was more elaborate. A surviving 14th century English cookbook called The Form of Curry, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II, reveals dishes that sound bizarre to modern ears: roasted swan with ginger sauce, pork with a sauce of bread crumbs and vinegar, almond milk flavored with saffron. Almond milk was everywhere in noble cooking, partly because of the fasting rules that banned dairy. Wealthy cooks used almond milk as a substitute for cow's milk on fast days, and they used it generously. These were not incompetent cooks throwing random ingredients together. These were highly skilled professionals who understood flavor combinations, texture, and presentation in ways that would be recognizable to a modern chef. They just had a completely different set of ingredients to work with. And then there is drink. Water in medieval Europe was often unsafe, not because medieval people were ignorant of cleanliness. Many monasteries and towns carefully maintained wells and springs, but because water sources near settlements were frequently contaminated by animal waste, human waste, and agricultural runoff. So people drank ale. Ale was a daily staple, consumed by men, women, and even children at every meal. It was low in alcohol, caloric, and far safer than the local water. In southern Europe, wine served the same function. This was not drinking for pleasure. This was drinking for survival. The average adult in medieval England might consume 2 to 3 gallons of weak ale per day. Your body ran on grain and fermented liquid and nothing else. Here is the part that connects all of this to your life right now. You have more food available to you in a single supermarket than an entire medieval village saw in a year. You can eat tomatoes in January, chocolate from West Africa, and fish caught yesterday in the Pacific Ocean, all before lunch. You spend perhaps 10% of your income on food. A medieval peasant spent 80% or more and still went hungry multiple times a year. The great historian Eileen Power, writing in her classic work, Medieval People, nearly a century ago, observed that the ordinary worker of the Middle Ages lived closer to the edge of starvation than most modern people can possibly imagine. And she was not exaggerating. Famine was not a distant threat. It was a recurring, cyclical, expected part of life. The harvest could fail, the grain could rot, the winter could be too long, and people, real people with names and families, would simply die. The next time you stand in front of an open refrigerator and feel like there is nothing to eat, remember the peasant pottage. Remember the turnip. Remember the dark, hard bread that was your whole world. The abundance you live inside was built on thousands of years of desperate, monotonous, hand-to-mouth survival. And it was built by hands you will never know, on soil you will never see, by people who would weep at the sight of your grocery store. Your hunger is a luxury they could never afford.